Welcome to the Sales Compensation Show, where we share the latest sales performance research, insights, and solutions through in-depth discussions with industry experts. So put that spreadsheet away, grab a beverage, and enjoy the conversation. I'm your host, Justin Lane. I've always said people are just going to do what they're good at or what's easy.
Yeah.
And the pay is, disconnected, as opposed to being a driver of behavior. And yeah, I think I've seen survey data. There was a company, I want to say it was CSO Insights, or it might have been the CEB, but they did a survey one time and it was somewhere in the low 30s. Let's say 33% of reps raised their hands and said, I don't understand how I'm supposed to get paid. And that was just fascinating to me when I saw that. I'm like, it's one of those statistics where you're like, that can't be true. And then as you talk to people, and you talk certainly to comp admin teams that field disputes throughout the year, they're like, oh, that's true. People are asking or have a misunderstanding of how they're actually getting paid. Like you said, into Q3, of a planned year, they still don't get it.
Yeah.
Let's jump back a little bit. So you made this point where you feel like maybe companies, like the process of comp plan design hasn't really changed a lot in maybe 40 years. And so you started a software company to address this problem. Like what was that? Talk me through this thought process.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because you see things early in your career and sometimes you see things, they don't make sense, but you think this is kind of the status quo and you're waiting to learn more. And so, I remember even some of my first projects that I did when I was at ZS, where, first and foremost, the people that are designing the plan, like the tools, the people, the teams involved in the design process are not the same as the tools and the people and the teams involved in the execution process. There may be slight overlap, but they're completely disconnected. Yeah, it's completely disconnected. And so we would do this design process. And I remember being in a meeting where, we're about to roll out a plan to the ops and comp team as a part of our strategy. And someone puts up their hand and says, we can't actually calculate that plan because that metric doesn't exist. It's going to take us over 6 months to bring it in. Again, you're early in your career, you hear these things and you're like, oh, I don't know, maybe this is the way the business operates. But it didn't feel right. And it felt wrong that we were, why were we stuck in this old process? And then you see it time and time again. It's happening in every business. At first, maybe it's a one-off occurrence. Okay, it's this business. They're not very sophisticated. But in reality, this is the lay of the land. Design, like planning and execution, are completely disjointed today. The second part is that every platform in this space, having experience implementing or being on the implementation side of this process, every platform is effectively this toolkit to help you solve the calculation of the actual payout. But I need to solve it for my business. And so I basically architect and I design the data pipelines based off of my needs as a customer. But every one of these instances is isolated. It's done in siloed fashion. In fact, I've worked with some organizations where different divisions within that company have this implementation of the same software, but it's different instances. And you have two teams in different parts of the organization, or different geos, maybe different business units, that are basically building rules where, yes, okay, in aggregate, there are different business rules and different data, et cetera. But at a more granular level, you realize there's a lot of similarity in what you're doing, and you couldn't copy paste from one instance to another in a streamlined way that was efficient and enabled you to actually not replicate work. And so, I left consulting thinking about this and being like, well, why can't we use the tools that we pay to do the strategic planning? And ultimately, it's because of this siloed and very repetitive and rigid nature to the way that we think about payouts, where if it takes you weeks to configure a plan and you need a new instance to configure a test case every single time, you're not going to set up 10 sandbox instances of these platforms and then configure 10 different plans that you're modeling to financially figure out which one you want to go with. It would take you months and months to do that. And so what do? You keep design over here and you model it based off estimates, and you're doing it in Excel to create your ideal plan. And so, I left actually thinking that I wasn't, I left consulting. I wanted to go into tech. And that's when I got reached out to by a customer I'd worked with in the past and helped them implement one of these platforms. And so when they reached out asking for help because they were having issues and problems with the calculations, again, business upstream data change, upstream business rule change caused havoc on their implementation. And so all of a sudden, bring back the person who helped us implement it because he knows the architecture of how we design this. And so come back in, help them re-architect, get it set up, get their teams, ready to go again. And then a year later, lo and behold, same issue. They need help again. And that was when I had the opportunity of pitching this idea of bringing strategy and execution together and ultimately removing the repetitiveness and the manual nature of building rules, and ultimately commoditizing the rule building by taking the business context of the plan design and translating it automatically to the underlying rules. And so this element of, why did I start a software company? Well, I started a software company to solve this problem. I think there's a massive gap in the market. I lived and breathed being in that role as a sales comp admin and sales comp, implementation partner. And I saw how painful it was for my customers. One of the most defeating things was we'd go through an implementation, and at the time back in, between, in 2012, 2013, the ICM players were just kind of getting out of the woodworks, like, for the most part, like exactly was less than a 10-year-old company at the time. And so, in my mind, every one of these projects was mostly greenfield. They were trying to implement these, these new platforms that were supposed to solve this problem. And you had these comp teams that you got very close with. You get very close to these people during an implementation project because it's long hours, hard work. And so the excitement of these implementations, and everyone's super excited for this future state of comp. And then the rollout happens and it's a complete letdown. And I saw that too many times.
Yeah.
Too many times and too many failures to not want to solve this problem. So I really saw, I started and built this company because I felt the pain so harshly myself.
On another episode of this season's podcast, I talked to a consultant who's been designing sales compensation plans for a number of years. And she describes a moment where the sales force, a number of people broke out into tears. My comment was, tears of joy? And the answer was no, definitely not, type of thing. So it's great to hear, the positive stories around sales compensation, of where when you do things, where the reps clearly can see a path to earning more money, it goes well. I think when there's some confusion, or the communication is not done well, or they don't understand, and they feel like maybe that their earnings potentials have been limited in this year, is where it doesn't go quite as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think the key part to that is just data driven. And I mean, in everything I do, if there's any, exceptions that come my way, whatever, I think that's also why I'm good at this role, is there's always the human element to it. But let's start with the data first. And so it's that clear communication that's backed by data of, here are the facts. Here would be my recommendation based on the facts. Now let's add in the human component. Does that change at all? Or is there something, oftentimes, where I would go and where I would make the recommendation is that if there is something based on the human component that we need to do for this individual, it belongs outside of sales compensation.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So let's talk about that human component for a second. And I think that in my experience, people try to get that experience in a variety of different ways, whether it's through direct feedback from the reps through a survey, or maybe trying, to get that feedback as a proxy from the sales managers. And on, the far end of the spectrum, people going on sales calls or listening to, some sales meetings to get a feel for what the sales reps do, and then trying to figure out, where do they have control or prominence over that sale. What did you do to get the perspective of the rep, or to make sure you understood the human component of the, what I always call the math problem that you're trying to solve?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I think the number one thing that feeds into everything else, and this goes for my current role and for my previous roles, is the sales VPs that I've supported
Mhm.
I've always had a great relationship with them, and it's always someone that they can come to me. I go to them at any point in time, and they are not only a partner, an ally, but most importantly, a resource. And just really setting that up as in when I reach out, we're in sales compensation, let's be honest, there are different areas of compensation where there is a conflict there, right? And they don't get along. And I think what I spent my initial time in this role and in my old role was, I am your friend. When I'm doing things, it is for the benefit of the business. And I'm truly curious when I'm reaching out and asking you. So I think it's that curiosity and partnership with those sales leaders. And then really through that, they just propel me down different paths. I mean, in my role at Adobe, just got really involved with our solution consultants, especially supporting our product specialists. We rolled out a new product, first product that Adobe rolled out, and I think about 20 years that wasn't an acquisition.
Okay.
So being part of that was really interesting. So that's why they had me involved with their solution consultant, so I could really get that on the street feedback. So yes, I would join sales calls again as I can. I do the same thing at Intermedia. Luckily, it's a little bit smaller, a little bit easier to get that information without having to sit in on those different calls. But again, it just gets back to that partnership with sales leadership and really having an ally there.
So you have a book about the idea of what a CEO needs to know about sales compensation.
Right.
And I think I've heard you talk a number of times about connecting strategy to sales compensation, corner office to front line.
Right. Right.
Balance this out against the idea that, as I talk to a lot of companies, we have sales comp planning, we have sales comp execution, and these two things maybe sit in different business functions at different levels in the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
How should people reconcile this idea that it applies from the front line to the corner office, and then it sits in all these different places within the organization? Is there a way to streamline it, make sense of it?
Well, I think, at its essence, what we're trying to do with the sales compensation program is we're trying to get a message across to the sales organization. At its essence, the sales compensation program is a communications tool, right? So we want to say something to the sales organization. We want them to do something. And it'd be a whole lot easier just to pay everybody base salary and not go through all the machinations of how to design and manage sales compensation. But we do it because we're trying to get a message across. And that message is hopefully around the goals and objectives and the strategy of the business, or it could be the business unit or of the team that salesperson is working for. So when I look at kind of simplifying what we're trying to accomplish, sales compensation is not about trying to make sure people earn money or trying to make sure that we're doing certain detailed things in the organization. Sales compensation is trying to make sure that we're connecting the strategy to the salesperson. So the part of the strategy that they can control, they are motivated to do that. So we want to connect strategy, and we also want to make sure that it's going to be something that's going to be motivational and exciting and is going to drive behavior. So when I wrote the book, Justin, I actually wasn't interested in writing a sales compensation book because I thought, there's several sales compensation books out there and there's some pretty good ones. But what I realized was missing was a couple things. One was there wasn't anything that really talked about how to make that strategic connection, hence the title, what your CEO needs to know. It's kind of tongue in cheek, right? It's really what you need to know about sales compensation, or anybody needs to know. But a lot of companies weren't making that connection to the strategy. The other was, as sales compensation books go, they're kind of boring, right? So you get into like 40 different sales compensation plan examples, or here's how the mechanics work, whatever. And what's the first thing an executive does with that book? They give it to their analyst, right? Here you read this. I'm not going to read a bunch of commission tables and stuff. So we needed something that actually talked to leaders who are heads of sales operations, who are heads of compensation, who are heads of HR, who are heads of companies like presidents and CEOs. So We wanted to make something that was going to be accessible and talk to those leaders, not just through a bunch of numbers and tables, but through methodology and models that help you with how to think about sales compensation and how to solve the problem, not just like, here's how a commission rate works. And one of the other things we did with the book was we wrote some interesting stories to kind of tie it all together, because stories are kind of at the core of our primal wiring, right? If I can tell a story about something, I can get that message across. So hopefully we created a book that actually helps people connect to that topic on a little bit more of a human level than just a technical level.
Here's another question. So you've been involved in sales compensation for a while. So I'm always interested, because I think that the longer folks have been around sales compensation, the more we think about things the same. How often do you think sales compensation plans should be reviewed?
I would say at least quarterly.
Quarterly,
So,
okay.
yes. So you want to also look for soft measures. Yeah. So you don't want to look only for hard measures like my revenue or my market share. Yeah. So you would also want to look at cancellations. You want to look into the backlog. Have I got enough in my pipeline? Are my processes working? How is my forecast accuracy and these kind of things? So just going by revenue, how much is my revenue versus the compensation I paid? That's one measure, but it's not really meaningful if you don't look at all the other things. Yeah. So there are many things that you can consider, and you really should set them up in the beginning of the year. So what do I think is the measure for having a successful sales plan, a successful salesperson, and a success for my company? So these are the three things that you want to look for.
No, I really like this idea of a quarterly review. When I asked the question, I was very much expecting the once a year answer, because that's how I was, taught in the consulting world 20 years ago, that you designed it and it was almost a fire and forget strategy. And then at the end of the year, once again, you took this backwards look as to what had happened, and then you made changes. But, the opinion or thought process was that you had to let it run for some period of time to see if it was really changing anything. And now I think with the accessibility and the amount of data that we have around, like you said, both hard measures, soft measures, that we can monitor it on a more frequent basis and see if things are working the way we wanted them to, and maybe make changes if needed.
Yes, that's the point. If you measure during the year and you see this product sale is going downhill, why is it? Yeah, so you have the chance to implement measures that go against the trend, and you can see like, oh, what do I need to push this product? Yeah, so is there something wrong with my product? Is what's going on? So if you measure, or if you check more regularly and do a bit more deeper dive, you can work against the trend and be more successful.
Yeah. So at top of the show, I mentioned you recently had a post on sales compensation communication. I loved it. It had nice 1, 2, 3, 4, a checklist of steps for people to follow. And to me, this is one of the areas where people do a ton of work on the design project. And then at the very end, they fall down and fail to communicate it to the field force in an effective manner.
Yes.
What do you think what are some of the best tips you could share for the folks listening today on?
There are a couple of things. So number one, get everyone engaged. Yeah. So you should never do it on your own. Yeah. So you need to reach out to HR. You need to reach out to finance. You need to know and understand the company strategies. You should always have a rollout plan. Yeah. So who is communicating what to when to whom? Yeah. So that's very important, because communication, everyone in the company should know what your company strategy is, not only the executive level. Yeah. So everyone in the company would like to support your strategy, but if they don't know it, how can they support it? And with the sales plan, what I usually did, when I had my educational rounds with the sales folks, I would start always with, this is what we want from you, and this is why we want it from you. Yeah. So, I mean, there's some elements that you can't reveal, like if you were planning a huge merger or these kind of things, yeah, that has impact on your share price. But other than that, you can communicate anything. And I get a lot of feedback from the sales folks like, oh, that's the first time we ever understood a sales plan. And then they are more successful because then they know what is expected from them. Yeah. And I also start my education rounds usually with, do you want to drive a Porsche or do you want to drive a Golf? And then they normally look at me very confused, like, because of course they want to drive a Porsche. Yeah. So I mean, both very good cars. Yeah. But yeah. And then I explain to them what they need to do to drive.
Here's the steps to get there, what you need to do.
These are the steps to get there. Yeah.
One of the things I say a lot to people, probably, people that have heard me or talked to me on the phone, have probably at some point in time heard me say that common practice is rarely best practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of what people find around sales compensation when they do a quick Google search is common practice, right? Maybe it's a sales leader or a CEO saying, well, here's what I've seen. Here's what's, at different companies.
Right.
And people put a halo or expert bias around, they're good at one thing, they must be knowledgeable about another thing. But I've also seen, talking to a lot of companies over the years, you see kind of some repeating themes or patterns, and people want benchmarks. They want to know what everybody else is up to. I think the longer I do this, the more I'm like, why do you care what everybody else is up to, type of thing. But you mentioned, right, that you have some contrarian views. You like to challenge the status quo. What types of common practices would you say maybe aren't best practices, and you would give people different advice around?
Yeah, I would say there's probably two that immediately come to mind. One is figure out a way to make sure that you have a clear culture and interweave it wherever possible into your plan. And when I say plan, that is everything that encircles that. And this is the approach that your leadership takes. It is in the plan document wherever possible. Like, what is our purpose, our mission, and our values that we want to act upon? And oh, by the way, we want our customers to feel on a daily basis from us. It's that sort of thing. And the reality of that is it has to be different for every company. So this is a little bit of the contrarian perspective. You can't take a job description and you can't take an old plan, dust it off and say, this will work, because it needs to be distinct and unique to you and your strategy at this moment in time. And after your strategy changes and after this year changes, it's out the window. You have to look at these things to address specific needs of your organization at that moment in time, because we all know the world changes. So we need to make sure that we keep up with it rather than a one and done, because it just doesn't play out that way. It doesn't work in the long run. And then the other one is math matters more than benchmarking. And so in this case, and this is why I appreciate more of the small business approach, is if you can't afford median, or you can't afford best practice, then you just have to figure out another way to address what it is that you can offer, to bring on the right person who lines up with what it is that you're trying to accomplish for your organization. And because that is reality for most every organization that is not the really big players, right? What you have to do is do something that is almost necessarily not common, right? In order for you to stand out, which means you have to think creatively to address that. And kind of in this case, not exactly act the way that everybody else does. So that's the part where I feel like it's okay to be different. In fact, it's so much better to be distinct and to be different, because you have to be. You don't have the dollars in many cases to be like everybody else. And oh, by the way, as soon as you become vanilla like everybody else, then what exactly do you stand for? And what exactly do you go and pursue? And how do you differentiate yourself in the marketplace? It's all of those things. It's those of taking a little bit of a different approach entirely, or a different stance, I think is exactly what you want to do in order to stand out.
I think I share a curiosity about the world with you, and I'm always, trying to read things, learn things. And while I was doing that, I ran across one of your papers where you explored the idea of a hot hand in sales. And this was absolutely fascinating to me. I think from my perspective, this was something that I heard a lot about as a kid, being a fan of the National Basketball Association here in the States, and hearing announcers talk about this idea. At one point in time, I thought that contemporary wisdom was that it didn't really exist. It was a bias of some sort. But you decided to explore this idea in sales. And again, I'd love to hear kind of how did you come upon this particular idea, and what did you find?
I mean, I'm glad you picked that project out. That's probably my favorite project that I've worked on, and it's been the most difficult, and it's led to the most success. We finally got that paper published this year after a really, really long process of doing the work and then going through lots of different revision processes in the journal, and it's published in the Journal of Marketing Research now. And we call that phenomena, which many of us sports fans call hot hand. We called it in our paper, we call it momentum. But it really is ultimately relating to hot hand. And, we kind of came up with this idea because it was the kind of idea that just seemed like a standard. Am I stopping at this point? Because with a little bark like that, would I stop? Yeah.
I was just going to stop for 1 second. It's the
it's okay. Yeah.
The inevitable Amazon delivery that I try to encourage my significant other to schedule on Amazon Day, which is Thursday here.
That's okay. Yeah, we have the same thing. It's no problem. In future, if you're going to cut your volume, I can just keep going, right?
Okay.
If you're happy with that. I just didn't want to know whether you were what you were going to do. Whatever.
No, it's actually it's funny enough. The folks at the podcast, production companies say that it sounds more authentic and people it's more relatable that you're. Okay. I'm like, I guess I
haven't heard that one before, but
no, to me, I know it's just fine. Blood pressure, rising, anxiety type of thing.
Yeah, yeah. But okay, so where do we want me to start? I can start from. Do you want to run that question again rather than me try and pick up halfway, and I can start again?
I'm trying to think of the. I think okay.
It was a nice link, I have to say. So, okay, maybe I can just start the answer again if I can just remember. You linked it really nicely, like curiosity, and then came in to ask me about that, and you're sort of like, where did that come from? Yeah, so I started by talking about it's one of my favorite projects. So I'll begin with that, and you can just cut me in after your question, I think. Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad you picked that project out because it's probably my favorite project that I've ever worked on. It's certainly been the most difficult one and the longest project. We had the original idea for that project. I still remember a meeting in 2010 or 2011, I think, I at the University of Houston at the Bauer School of Business there in the Stagler Institute of Sales Excellence, which is run by Professor Mike Ahern, who's a good friend of mine. And I went over there on my sabbatical from when I was working in the UK. I went over there just to learn from him. We learned the way he did things and learned the kind of research. And one of the first few days we sat down and had a talk about things we're interested in. We're both big sports fans. And he had a student working on intuition, which is Zach Hall, who's a professor at TCU now, an awesome project on intuition of salespeople. And in talking about that, we came up with these psychological phenomena that were interesting. And one of them was the hot hand, and because all of these psychologists they were all working in that same kind of area, the idea of human biases and pattern recognition, and hot hand interested us because it was exactly as you say, something that had a really well accepted psychological opinion, which was that it doesn't exist, that it's just a human bias. In other words, we're biased to see patterns in performance or in any kind of data sequence. Yet those patterns don't really represent anything different from the long run average. And you think about that in basketball scoring or whatever. You think, well, if someone's got a long run average percentage of field goals in basketball, it looks like they're in the hot hand, but in reality, according to psychology, they're not really in a hot hand. We're just seeing this short run pattern, but it's not representative of any change in state. So you can't use that information to predict the likelihood of their next shot going in any more than you could use their overall long run field goal average, right? So if they shoot at 50%, the fact that you think they're in the hot hand doesn't mean they're more likely to shoot the next basket. That's the theory. That's what your listeners might have heard of Kahneman and Tversky, and Tversky published a very influential paper in the 70s about this, using free throw data and various other basketball studies to show, in his mind, that this didn't exist. It was a bias. And the more we talked about it, myself and Mike, the more we thought that this just can't be true. In reality, that it just can't be. It can't be correct to say that there's no such thing. Because when you think about it, that means that your kind of psychological state couldn't really have any influence on your transient performance. And we know that people who are more confident probably perform better. It certainly feels that way. So we thought to ourselves, both of us are pretty contrarian people. We like disproving stuff and showing that there's a different way of looking at stuff. And we said, let's study that. And if to study that, what would we need? We'd need a big data set of people's real calls, right, in sales. And it so happened that coincidentally at that time I had access to that. I had a call center company in Europe that was very keen to do research with me, and they'd agreed to give me their records of their call centers for as long as I wanted. And we ended up using 3 months. Which was a kind of campaign for a product. It was outbound calls, and we had all of the calls. Probably, I forget the exact numbers now, and probably if someone reads the paper, that they might find it totally wrong. But you have many thousands of calls for about 100 sales reps over 3 months, and we had every call, how long it lasted, what was the result, all of this CRM system data, and the thing that's changed between now and the 70s. Is the statistical methods we have access to are way more sophisticated. And actually, if you reanalyze some of that original data from the early studies, you do find the effect, the hot hand effect, because of the way that we can do things now. We can remove biases. We can do things in a much more sophisticated way. And it turned out that we could find an effect that people did seem to change these states from being hot and being cold. It's something we found which no one has really talked about. And the weird thing is, it turned out that about the same time, quite a few other teams seemed to have this idea that we could show hot hand existed. No one really looked at it in business, but there were a lot of other sports studies that came out. There's an awesome study on basketball. 10-pin bowling, we would call it 10-pin bowling in the UK. You would just call it bowling, I guess. And a bunch of other studies that showed how the mathematics of the original studies is just not right. So that it's actually more likely that the hot hand does exist than doesn't exist. So if we had got our paper accepted straight away, we would have been the first to show that, and maybe we would have got a Nobel Prize, but I doubt it. But we now would claim to be the first to show it in a business context with a real world job, as long as you don't count poker as a real world job, which is debatable, I guess. So that's the story. I mean, long-winded, I suppose, and we created an idea that you could actually. Because we showed them in the paper, we show the mathematics of predicting whether somebody is in a hot hand or not with the equations, and we showed a way that you could integrate those equations in a management information system, where in a real-time sense you could get an indication, if you're a manager of a call center, for example, of whether your salespeople were in a hot state or a cold state, and whether they're transitioning as well in real time. Not that challenging to do that if you're I guess, a programmer, to actually integrate that. And we haven't tested anyone who's integrated it in, but what we did was we simulated the same call center, but if they had used our management information system, they would have increased their sales by about 15% over the course of that 3-month period, if I remember correctly, the exact numbers.
What type of metrics have you put in place to gauge the effectiveness of the plan?
So we have a new plan methodology this year. So we went from paying a kind of a flat rate type way to a true OTE model. A big shift, right? There's folks who have been at Workiva for a very long time on the old model that aren't used to kind of the newer folks coming in that are used to on-target earnings or an OTE model. End of the day, kind of the math's the same. It's just new vernacular. And what we wanted to pay attention to first was, have we set that up correctly? So there was a lot of work that went into that to make sure we are paying, we pride ourselves in paying above market average for, great sellers when we do that. And then we looked at what teams need support that can be handled by more, junior selling or reps that we need to fill that gap, kind of that middle ground. And so we've come to a really good balance on the OTE. And so now the metrics are all about, in the beginning, just trying to gauge what is our difference in sales by product, by team, by region, and variable comp that goes along with that. So that's going to be baseline just from a financial accounting type responsibility. And then we have not had any shifts in trajectory of timing. But what we did about 1.5 years ago is we changed how much we credit in the future. So in other words, if there's a future start date. So we honed in on that and we try to look at every deal. If it closed that month, the current month, prior month, or that following month, was there any change in behavior trajectory when we made that change on to how far in advance you get credited? So we've done some of that. And then on back to the model change itself, we'll be looking at, we just sent out a rep scorecard. It has 26 competency metrics that ASDs are in charge of filling out. So they actually are filling out for their reps and giving their opinions about where there's coachable opportunities, where there's selling behaviors that they think are coachable, or is there something that they can help train others, take away, right, good behaviors and then teach others. And we try to work those in and that feedback into spiffs and contests as well, because we believe that's the best way to draw those out. It's kind of like the Audi example. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just want to dig deeper into that. So this idea is very interesting to me. You have a competency model. You said about 26 different dimensions to it.
Mm-hmm.
You sent it out to the sales managers to fill out for their people. Quick question: are the individuals, do they have any input, like from a 360-degree view, or is it just top-down kind of view of here's where I see this person up against these competencies?
So it's the first line manager, director, if there is one, and then the VP. So they all came in. And so first line manager first took their pass, and then the other two layers added it in. We're at the point right now where that'll be shared back.
And then you're creating, you said, some sort of incentives, spiffs or something around improvement to this competency model. Is that the individual level or at some kind of aggregate? If you felt like everybody across the board, maybe you were low in negotiation, so you want to improve negotiation, or is it at the individual or team level, I guess is the next question.
So what we're doing is we're trying to bucket into a theme per quarter. So as you probably agree, right, you can't do 20 spiffs and you need to do things that are meaningful and change behavior and do it for the long term. I don't want 15 spiffs. But what we wanted to do is pull out where the good behaviors are and how can we convince others that they're meaningful activities to either go do or chase. Not everything necessarily means it's a spiff, but it might be a gate to get a spiff. So for example, one of our divisions is chasing a particular steal for a spiff in Q1. It's a specific competitor that came out of the gate and we want to focus on them. But the minimum to get the spiff is a gate around Salesforce hygiene, which, as everybody has issues with that, we need to improve that in a couple areas. So they have to have checks, there's checks every Friday to make sure that their opportunities achieve the Salesforce hygiene. And then there's a gate on our pitch deck, essentially, right? We get a new pitch deck every year, every half, that we want the reps to be versed on, know how to speak to it, know how to give the pitch. A lot of your tenured folks, they don't care to do that. They think they know it. They sell, they get attainment. Great, I'm a great seller. Well, that's not true, right? Attainment isn't the only thing that gauges whether you're a good seller or not. So we have these gates to ensure that our most tenured sellers still stay engaged, but at the same time that they have opportunities to teach others. And we have ways around that and some spiffs around that.
The Sales Compensation Show was brought to you by Forma.ai, the world's most advanced sales compensation solution. To learn more about how Forma.ai makes sales comp more valuable to your business, visit Forma.ai. Find us by searching for Sales Compensation in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. On behalf of the team here at Forma.ai, thank you for listening and stay smart out there.